Hey guys, iKailaKai here, and today I want to look at 10 cards that have become stronger with the ban of Red Purple Law. Now, Red Purple Law's playstyle is extremely oppressive, and as such, many cards that are in fact strong were just simply not playable due to the fact that Red Purple Law's kit countered many types of cards. As such, in this video, I want to be looking at which cards might be able to come back into the meta due to the fact that now Red Purple Law is no longer a part of the meta. Now, the first thing that I want to go over is what exactly Red Purple was doing, and with his moves, what was he gaining from the meta? Now, to put it simply, what Red Purple was doing was putting a 3000 power or less character to the bottom of the deck to put his own 4 cost or less character to the field. As such, what this was doing was removing the opponent's lower power board, as well as developing his own board. Let's look into 10 cards in specific and some similar cards that fall into the same category, and talk about why they're suddenly stronger now. The first card that I'd like to talk about is Shirahoshi, but in general, the category of low-cost blockers. Now, low-cost blockers in general have been really strong ever since OP01. We started to stop seeing one-cost blockers when Rebecca started to become a deck. We started to stop seeing 2 or 3-cost blockers once Sakazuki started to become a deck. And of course, now with Red Purple Law, we stopped seeing anything that was 3000 power or less. This is part of why you were seeing things that were 4000 power or less, like Shiraya. But of course, now that Red Purple is gone, we can afford to put in these 3000 power or less cards again. Shirahoshi is the biggest winner of this because her effect can't really be denied by black decks that would usually just KO these lower cost blockers. As such, Shirahoshi tends to stay on the board, and the only counterplay in bottoming her is now effectively gone. Especially in this meta where board clear has started to come down a little bit, Shirahoshi and even any sort of other lower power blocker like Bichi, Choppa, the new 3-cost Nami, 4-cost Rebecca even, these cards have become stronger in general. The second card to look over is, of course, single target removal. Now, single target removal was always strong. However, due to the fact that Red Purple was such a fast deck that would play 2 things per turn, these sorts of cards that can only remove 1 character for 1 card were generally low in value, as of course if you were going to get rid of Red Purple as Kid and Killer, then they might still have a 4-cost Law on the board. These sorts of things were just a bit difficult to play with, so consider these kinds of larger scale removal decks now that the meta seems to be starting to slow down. Of course, this may change once a new aggro deck comes into the meta, whether it's Animal Zoro or Doflamingo once the start decks come into the meta. But until then, or in any sort of meta where you start to see the entire meta starting to slow down, these sorts of cards can be very good to tech into your deck. Now, although Red Purple Law only gets rid of 3000 power cards or less, the card that really broke the deck was Raise Max and Gordon. These cards that just minus 3000 power anything for 1 dome ended up making it so that effectively your leader ability could get rid of any 6000 power or less. As such, 6000 power characters that have a strong effect on the board have generally become stronger. Cards like Cavendish, which on attack gain Yudong, now can actually survive until the next turn, where let's be honest, in the past meta was just not going to happen. Any of these sorts of cards that have a continuous effect the longer that they're on the board become stronger because the opponent would need to physically hit into them, and it's not easy to hit into them if they're 6000 power because it's 1000 power above your leader. As such, it makes them feel a bit more tanky and a bit easier to defend, and the opponent might not be in a situation where they want to necessarily hit it and end up going to life, letting your character stick to the board more. These sorts of cards sticking to the board end up accruing more advantage over time and end up leading to a bigger advantage. In this same vein, as Red Purple Law was actually bottom decking the card and not actually KOing the card, cards with these strong KO effects are actually stronger now. These cards would be stuff like Marco, both Marcos, and even things like Magellan. These sorts of cards that would have just been answered with 1 Gordon and a leader effect can now stick to the board and are much more annoying to deal with because the opponent will have to deal with the KO effect at some point. What's especially interesting about Marco and Magellan, for example, is that with the new start decks that are going to be coming out in OP08.5, in the Whitebeard start deck as well as the Purple Luffy start deck, both of these cards might end up seeing more play as things like Marco or Whitebeard even, and also Purple Luffy are going to be getting buffs, and these cards are very much staples in those kinds of decks. Now, of course, Red Purple Law's thresholds in bottoming a 3000 power or less or a 6000 power or less was very difficult to deal with. But one other threshold that people don't actually really consider is the 8000 power threshold. Now, the 8000 power threshold, generally cards like Jack, Kid, or the other Kid want to stay on the board to continue to accrue advantage over time, and because you're 8000 power, you generally can do this, which is why they cost more to play. However, Red Purple didn't necessarily need to clear them, they just need to use 1 Gordon to make the power 5000. This was especially punishing for something like 7-cost Kid, as although you would -1 dong to make your leader 6,000, with 1 Gordon they make your 7-cost skid 5,000, and if they just hit into that, it's effectively like nullifying the effect of the 7-cost skid, meaning that you generally have to let the 7-cost skid go. As such, 7-cost skid especially is extremely strong compared to past metas where Red Purple Law would just get rid of it with 1 card. In the case of the green 8-cost skid, for example, generally you'd play the 8-cost skid with something like the 2-cost Roshinante so that you can keep your board out of range of the opponent's 4-cost Richi. However, Red Purple Law would of course just bottom either your 2-cost Roshinante or use 2 Gordons and just bottom your kid, and as such, these sorts of cards, although they may not still feel as powerful as things like Red Rock can still counter them, they will still accrue advantage if they are unanswered, so find these timings where they just simply can't be answered. And of course, Jack is an 11 cost, which is just extremely hard to answer if you're, for example, a black deck. Also, fun fact if you didn't notice, the reason why Jack is an 11 cost is because in a deck of playing cards, the Jack card is considered an 11. You know, Jack, Queen, King. That's the only reason. And him being 11 has made so many problems, because if he was just 10, for example, then Perona could deal with it with Ice Age, Leader Effect, Duma. But because he's 11, we can't. Sorry, ran over. One card that I haven't seen anyone talking about, and I won't necessarily say that this is going to define the meta, but I definitely think it's very interesting because he is significantly stronger now that Red Purple Law is gone, is of course the Ice Oni. Now the reason why the Ice Oni was never used was because it's a very combo-centric card where you need to have the Playgrounds. If you don't have the Playgrounds, then it's very difficult to play Ice Oni, and you can't play Playgrounds without the Ice Oni. As such, it's hard to say if this combo can actually be used, but I will say in a meta where there is still board spread but not necessarily board clear, in something like Animal Zoro or Blue Doflamingo, this sort of card might have potential, so maybe keep it on your radar, and if you're cooking something interesting with Queen, give it a try. These sorts of cards that have very strong effects generally have lower power to compensate for them and have higher costs, and just having the flexibility now in deck building where you're allowed to have these more lower power, high cost, high value cards can be very good. Another example, of course, that I actually think is very strong in the meta is the 4-cost Bonkure. Now, of course, something like Lucci can deal with it, but many decks can't actually deal with it, and that's why he was such a strong card in the past. Not only does he only cost 4, he gets it on active, he has counter, and he copies an opponent's attack, which means that he can hit for like up to 12,000 if the opponent can't deal with it, which a lot of the time they can't, because something like Pudding does not have the tools to deal with this sort of card. As such, if you are going to go against decks like Pudding or Purple Luffy, just these sorts of decks in general that want to develop their own plan, definitely use this as a tech card to deal with the opponent. Now the 8th card on this list is Kirosu. Now, maybe people don't really know this because it seems like my YouTube channel exploded out of nowhere very organically, but for people who have been following me for a long time, they'll know that I was a massive Rebecca player from OP04. Kiros not just being immediately bottom decked when you play him is very nice, and is something worth considering as something, of course, like Sebo also has the same treatment. These kind of cards that can't be KO'd but were being bypassed by just being bottom decked now have a stronger chance in the meta, and as such, of course, this means that black is maybe stronger than it's ever been. Although I'm not a Rebecca player right now, as you may have seen from my playmat, she's still my favorite character. Mainly Kirosu and Rebecca's backstory was really nice to me, so let's hope for the future that we're going to get some nice buffs in OP010. The last type of card that I'd like to mention in this list are low power activate main cards. In particular, activate main searchers have always been strong. They dipped in power when Zoro was very strong, as he would just swarm the board with things that were higher in power than your searchers, resulting in just them taking them for free. But otherwise, these sorts of cards have always been strong, and in recent times have been wavering just by the fact that Red Purple Law will bottom them while he's just simply trying to develop his board. But now that Red Purple Law is gone, green in general that can use the activate main searchers, and even Teach in OP09, who also has an activate main searcher, can find a lot of success in stalling the opponent's game plan by absorbing hits while they get the parts that they need for their combos. I want to finish off this list with a very interesting card that I think has some sort of interesting viability. Whether or not it'll end up being in the final lists, I cannot say for sure, but I definitely think that it's very funny. So Enies Lobby was the other card that was banned alongside Red Purple Law, but due to the fact that Red Purple Law is gone, suddenly this Uta might be viable. If the opponent doesn't have any out-of-hand board clear, and you can permanently clear the opponent's board, then Uta will stick to the board permanently, like Enies Lobby. And as Enies Lobby and Uta both rest themselves to -2 cost something and can't realistically be hit back, Uta is kind of a weird replacement for Enies Lobby. As such, I think it's actually worth considering in decks that can keep the board completely empty. If you're playing a deck like Teach or Moria, for example, that mildly clear the board and build up their own board, you probably wouldn't be able to use this card, but if you're playing a deck like Rebecca, like Perona like Lucci, then this might be a card to consider as another option to reduce power efficiently, the same way that Enies Lobby did. These are the general overarching categories that I believe have become stronger with the ban of Red Purple Law, but of course there are many cards within these categories and even some cards that I didn't think of that have become stronger. As such, in this unstable meta where people are still trying to find what's actually good, these sorts of cards can end up getting you an extra leg up in these tournaments where people are unsure. These sort of simple things like low cost blockers or on KO effects that we've generally forgot about the power of are actually powerful. It just wasn't the right meta for them. As such, it's going to be very exciting to see what ends up happening not only with the meta in the East, but also the West, to see what sort of cards end up coming out on top as meta staples from now on. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.